Hi, I'm Walt Murray from Master Control, and today we'd like to introduce a new series with three parts to it regarding ISO 13485, which is the Quality Management System standard for medical device use. And we're going to just introduce some comments and concepts um, as from a timing perspective as to how the new 9001 standard and other implications will influence this standard as it goes through its change into the first quarter of 2016. So as we give a description to what it is we're going to talk about here in getting ready for the 2016 revision change to this standard, we're going to just give you an overview in part one and talk about the what, why, when, and how aspects of this. And then in the second part, we're going to talk about the guts of some of those changes relative to the new standard as it moves through the draft and comment stages into its final draft and voting by international bodies so that the standard actually becomes formalized. The third component of this series will actually speak specifically to risk and opportunity orientation of the standard as it relates to how a business will now be looking at explicit understanding and from even from an auditing perspective, how a company would explain those risk-based orientations or opportunity-based orientations that allow a company to act in very explicit terms as to how they would move forward and for improvement of their system and their business as a result of the new standard. Let's back up a little bit and just basically understand what is ISO 13485 for those of you out there that are trying to understand this. It's a series of requirements. It's designed to help medical manufacturers develop a quality system, or what we refer to as a QMS. These requirements basically are used by an organization in the full cycle of the product related to the business. So design and development, production, and even post-production installation and servicing orientation to the product or medical device, which includes design and development related to all the provisions associated with the product, which may include also those services. So right now, what's interesting is that we have three common versions, basically, of this 13485 standard out there. The 2003 version, which basically is the primary international standard without any unique changes or additions to it. The 2012 version of ISO 13485, of course, had a little bit more of a European harmonized version, which basically replaced the 2003 version on the basis of the EN ISO orientation of that standard to meet the intent and design of regulation in the European theater. The third one, of course, is the CAMCAS, or the Canadian equivalent for the 2003, which is needed to be able to secure specifically a Canadian medical device license, regardless of the classification of the device. So just know that floating out there are a couple of different versions with some slight nuances that are there, and that the big change is, of course, how will all of these migrate to a 2016 edition or version. So in terms of the standard as it relates to compliance under the what we refer to as the QSR, quality system requirement for GMP, or general manufacturing practice, and all of the general best practices associated with medical device. Companies now are going to have to kind of deliberate which road to take relative to the use of the standard, but won't really be able to do that until after there is a a common deliberation relative to the new 9001-2015 standard as it relates to cause and effect for the understanding of how it will influence the existing standard. So we're just going to introduce the point that there will be similarities to consider and there will be differences to consider. And of course, kind of picture in your mind that this checklist is something that will provide comparisons for that kind of deliberation as companies go about developing their systems. So why is this standard changing? Well, first of all, excuse me, it needs to be consistent with the new convention of what's referred to as a high-level system, or HLS, which is basically the description of the new 9001-2015 standard. And its convention is different. The line items are different. There are additional elements. There are changed elements. There are eliminated components within the elements. There's a lot of things that have happened in the writ of the new standard. And with good intent, the risk component is now prolific through the whole standard. The movement of such things as components of management responsibility, which has been eliminated, has now been replaced with a leadership component, and management responsibility, which was part of that, is now being looked at as part of improvement specifically relative to the new standard as a high-level system. So what we're trying to deal with here is how do you create a globally harmonized quality system? And that is the cause and effect relationship that we're trying to understand as we look at how to incorporate concepts like risk management and not just in the design control sense, but also in the entirety of the quality system. So it's important for the need to be, to have relevance, if you would, as it relates to such things as suppliers of the device or components of the device within the manufacturer assembly of the product, and the relationship now referred to as external providers. What does that mean from a contract standpoint as it relates to consultants or contractors or actual suppliers of raw materials to the build of a product? And then also is the orientation as to how the standard addresses the life cycle of a device, and that's a major influencing component as we move towards the new version of 1345. So what's the timing of this? The timing is that basically we are moving through the second revision, or the second component, second phase, if you would, of 13485 in its evaluation by the committee, and comments being made in that regard. There's, as it typically happens, that period is starting to slide a little bit, but I think more importantly is because 13485 was not allowed to go through its revision change in 2015, it now will be influenced by the final draft and voting of the ISO 9001-2015 convention, and to see what the cause and effect relationship will be in the build, the look, and the application of the standard. So the goal then will be to look at that harmonization as it relates to the new standard or the new convention. Manufacturers are going to have to reconcile the divergence of these standards. I think that's probably what has maybe a little bit more consternation or anxiety around this. Also, the way registrars who certify companies around the standard and how they will be changing a format relative to the way in which auditing to a new standard will occur, and what kind of questions will be asked of management of the team in the manufacturing environment, the use of data, the explicit nature now of how we would ask about the use of data, how it's gathered, how it is, the analysis of the data works, and then of course how companies will struggle internally with this implementation as a result of the new standard. So I think the one thing that is important to recognize and that we won't make an assumption is how will a new version, the 2016 version, impact other versions of the standard. And this is where we don't have, unfortunately, the opportunity or the ability to stick with a standard we like. In that regard, the process for replacing a standard is to basically withdraw the existing edition and introduce the new one as it relates to the title page and the look of the standard. It's dated basically relative to what the standard is at that point, because there is a 3-year window typically with the time frame for an organization to actually move through how its planning transition will occur to become certified to the new standard. So is that we now are moving from ISO 9001 and the version of 2008 to ISO 9001 for the version of 2015, and the window then associated with the point at which that becomes a standard, and how an organization will react to that from a planning orientation in looking at implementing new components of elements within the standard. So how will a 9001 change affect an ISO 1345 in existence? Well, of course, the major thing here is that we want to talk about how will 13485 adapt to a high-level system orientation, and then secondly, will ISO 1345 adopt in new elements or components of those elements to be absorbed into the revision or the version of the new 13485 standard around the high-level system convention of the 9001 standard. So how will new elements be considered in the new standard? I think the importance is to recognize that nothing is outside the scrutiny of risk as it relates to all elements of the standard and how they're implemented. As a matter of fact, in the context of the new standard, there is a formal element, risk and opportunity, that is now an explicit component as a requirement of the standard. And what that means is that there will have to be formal documentation, audit trail for the expectation for management review, and other areas of responsibility, and how risk and opportunity analysis is engaged and implemented through objectives within the system, and how improvement comes about as a result of that in a closed cycle orientation, which is the design of the new system. So obviously the system will, for ISO 13485 as it relates to 2016, will have a requirement in the United States, as well as abroad. As a matter of fact, there are some rumblings right now about looking at how Europe is taking on adoption of the high-level system versus the committee that is sizing up 13485 to have more of the traditional look that it currently has, and moving wording within the current look so the look doesn't have to change, but the embodiment of the verbiage relative to the explicit nature or implicit nature of how things are done and the way it's implemented may be able to stay within its existing structure. So all those things we'll look at in part 2 as we go through and talk about some particular components of the standard that will have some significant change or opportunity for improvement for organizations in their system. So the bottom line is, please stay tuned. And I think it's important that organizations right now should be in the get ready stage from a planning perspective. Take into account, get your hands on and take into account the guts of the changes that are coming. And of course, the committee will be communicating the draft relative to weighing in on comments, as well as formal presentations and even in some cases challenges to the change in the standard. And these comments and inputs will come in from registrars, from companies registered to the standard in its application, to national and international regulatory agencies, and also interested parties that represent that or embody those types of companies that are under this conformance standard as it relates to GMP compliance in the world of medical device. So look forward to what's coming. We will have a part 2 here that will have some timing around where the current draft is in its change related to ISO 9001:2016. So good luck.